Two people, riding a single motorcycle down a quiet road in southern Lebanon, never made it to wherever they were going. An Israeli drone found them minutes after a ceasefire deadline had already technically taken effect, a truce announced by officials from the United States and the Gulf just hours earlier. They became the first confirmed deaths of a supposed peace that was already broken before the ink had time to dry. This is the story of how the Lebanon front, the quietest and most fragile piece of the entire regional war, exploded back open just as the wider Iran ceasefire was collapsing on every other side, and why a truce built on paper never actually stopped the bombs from falling on the ground. It started, in truth, more than a year earlier, back in November of 2024, when Israel and Hezbollah first signed a ceasefire brokered by the United States and France, meant to close the book on 14 months of brutal cross-border conflict. That agreement gave Hezbollah 60 days to withdraw its armed presence from the strip of territory between the Blue Line and the Litani River, with Israeli forces required to pull back over the same window while Lebanese army troops and United Nations peacekeepers moved in behind them. On paper, it was a clean, structured off-ramp. In practice, from the very first days, it was something else entirely. Hezbollah's own deputy political chief warned publicly that Day 61 would be different if Israeli forces failed to withdraw, a blunt signal that the group's patience for a truce it viewed as one-sided was already running thin before the first deadline had even passed. And Israel never actually stopped. Strike after strike continued to hit villages across southern Lebanon in the months that followed, even as officials in Washington and Tel Aviv kept insisting the ceasefire, broadly speaking, was holding. By the time this current war reached its boiling point, the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, the body tasked specifically with monitoring compliance under Security Council Resolution 1701, had documented more than 10,000 Israeli violations of Lebanese airspace and roughly 1,400 separate military activities inside Lebanese territory since the original ceasefire began. Those violations were not abstract. They translated into approximately 400 deaths and more than 1,100 injuries inside Lebanon during that monitoring period alone, casualties absorbed under the official banner of a truce that was supposedly in effect the entire time. The monitoring mechanism itself finally gave out completely once the wider war between Israel, the United States, and Iran erupted. At the last meeting of that oversight body, held at the end of February this year, Israeli representatives simply did not show up, effectively marking the death of the very framework that was supposed to be supervising this ceasefire in the first place. From that point forward, Israel operated in Lebanon with functionally no external body watching, no independent referee left standing to call a foul. By April of this year, the situation had deteriorated so badly that a fresh ceasefire had to be negotiated from scratch, this one brokered specifically by the United States and taking effect on April the 16th. And the reason a brand new truce was even necessary tells you everything about how catastrophic the intervening months had been. Weeks of escalating violence between Israeli forces and Hezbollah, intensified sharply in March after regional tensions tied directly to the wider Iran war spilled across the border, had by that point killed more than 2,000 people inside Lebanon and displaced over 1 million more from their homes. 1 million people, uprooted from towns and villages across an entire country, in a conflict most of the world outside the region was barely paying attention to, distracted by the louder, more dramatic headlines coming out of the Strait of Hormuz and Tehran. Even that April ceasefire, the one specifically designed to finally hold, began falling apart within its first days. Despite officials from the United States and Gulf nations confirming an agreed start time of 4 p.m. local time, Israeli forces carried out at least 12 air raids and sustained artillery shelling on southern Lebanon after that exact deadline had already passed. It was in the immediate aftermath of that barrage that Lebanon's national news agency reported the drone strike that killed the two people riding together on that single motorcycle, their deaths landing in the very window when the world had just been told the fighting was supposed to stop. Analysts covering the region openly raised concerns that Israel appeared to be deliberately undermining the fragile agreement, one tied directly to the broader diplomatic push trying to end hostilities across the entire Middle East, not just inside Lebanon's own borders. That single image, two ordinary people on a motorcycle, killed in the exact hour a ceasefire was supposed to protect them, is the human cost sitting underneath every diplomatic statement about this front of the war. They were not soldiers. They were not the target of any named operation the Israeli military later described in its own statements. They were simply present, in a country where more than 1 million of their neighbors had already been forced from their homes, at the precise moment a truce that existed mostly on paper failed to translate into a single quiet night on the ground. Let's look at exactly how deep the fighting cut in the weeks that followed, because the pattern only intensified from there. In one deadly stretch of strikes, Israeli attacks killed dozens of people across Lebanon, this wave arriving at the very same moment the United States and Iran were preparing to sit down for talks aimed at ending their own war and cementing the broader regional truce. The Israeli military stated it had struck in response to more than 50 projectiles Hezbollah had launched overnight toward Israeli soldiers operating inside southern Lebanon, accusing the group of violating the ceasefire in the process. Among the strikes during this period was one that hit the southern Lebanese village of Kennerit directly, where first responders were photographed pulling a body from the rubble of a home reduced to wreckage. This was not an isolated flare-up. This was a pattern repeating itself, village after village, strike after strike, running in parallel to an entirely separate diplomatic track where American and Iranian representatives, alongside mediators from Pakistan and Qatar, were meeting in Bürgenstock, Switzerland, to work through the details of the memorandum of understanding both sides had just signed that same week. Think about the sheer strangeness of that timing. While senior officials sat in a Swiss resort town discussing the fine print of a peace framework meant to end the broader Iran war, Israeli aircraft were simultaneously carrying out strikes across Lebanon that killed dozens of people in a matter of days. The diplomatic track and the military track were running on entirely separate clocks, each seemingly indifferent to what the other was doing, as if two completely different wars were being fought and negotiated at the exact same time by the exact same coalition of governments. This is where the fear becomes real. Because Lebanon has always been the piece of this regional conflict, most likely to spiral beyond anyone's ability to contain it. Hezbollah is not simply a militia holding a defensive position along a border. It is Iran's single most heavily armed regional proxy, built up over decades specifically as a deterrent and retaliatory force capable of opening a second front against Israel whenever Tehran needed the pressure released. Every strike Israel carries out inside Lebanon, every Hezbollah rocket launched back across the border, carries the standing risk of dragging Iran itself directly back into a fight. It has spent months trying to manage through fragile ceasefires and shuttle diplomacy rather than open warfare. A Lebanon front fully reignited does not stay contained to Lebanon. It becomes the tripwire that can pull the entire regional architecture, Iran, Israel, the United States, and every Gulf state caught in between, back into simultaneous overlapping conflict on multiple fronts at once. And that risk is not theoretical. Israeli forces, even under the terms of the ceasefire framework, still maintain physical control of 5 separate positions inside Lebanese territory, near the villages of Labuni, Marwahin, Aitarun, Hula, and Sarada. Those are not abstract lines on a map. Those are Israeli troops sitting on Lebanese soil, inside a sovereign nation's own borders, months after a ceasefire was supposed to have addressed exactly that kind of occupation. Lebanon's own prime minister described his country's position bluntly, calling it a one-sided war of attrition that kept escalating despite the paper agreements meant to end it. When a sitting head of government characterizes an active ceasefire in those terms, the diplomatic fiction of peace has already collapsed, whether the official documents have been formally torn up or not. This is where the domino effect really takes hold, because the Lebanon front does not exist in isolation from everything else this channel has already tracked unfolding across the region. The very same week Israeli strikes were killing dozens across southern Lebanon, Iran's own ceasefire with the United States was unraveling on an entirely separate track, with Iranian attacks on commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, triggering fresh American strikes across 5 Iranian provinces. The same week, Iran's newly proclaimed supreme leader was issuing public vows of vengeance for his father's death. The same broader window saw President Trump publicly threatening to decimate and destroy Iran over an alleged assassination plot against his own life. Lebanon was never a separate story from any of this. It was one more front in a single interconnected war, one where progress on any single track, the Iran talks, the Lebanon ceasefire, the Hormuz shipping crisis, depended entirely on progress holding on every other track simultaneously. A level of coordinated stability this region has not managed to sustain for more than a few days at a time throughout this entire conflict. Consider how each of these fronts feeds directly back into the others. A collapsing Lebanon ceasefire gives Iran's own hardliners fresh justification to argue that diplomacy with Washington is a trap, that every truce Israel signs gets violated within days regardless of what ink is spilled in Switzerland or Muscat. A reignited Hezbollah front pulls Israeli military resources and political attention away from managing the Iran negotiations cleanly, forcing Israeli leadership to fight a genuine two-front conflict, even as its most powerful ally tries to broker a wider regional peace. And every dead civilian, whether on a motorcycle in southern Lebanon or in a village like Kinneret, becomes fresh fuel for exactly the kind of public fury this channel has already documented erupting at Khamenei's funeral in Mashhad, anger that Iran's own leadership has shown itself more than willing to channel toward its enemies rather than toward genuine self-reflection about the cost of this war. Here is the wall of reality underneath all of this, and it cuts against the idea that anyone involved genuinely wants this fighting to stop on the terms currently on the table. Israel has now operated under two separate ceasefire frameworks with Hezbollah inside less than 2 years, the first from November 2024, the second from this past April, and has been documented violating both, repeatedly, at a scale running into the thousands of incidents. That is not the record of a government treating a truce as a genuine binding constraint on its own behavior. That is the record of a government treating a ceasefire as a temporary pause between operations it fully intends to continue whenever it judges the moment strategically necessary. Hezbollah, for its part, has shown its own willingness to fire dozens of projectiles across the border, even while nominally bound by the same truce, evidence that the group is equally unwilling to treat these agreements as anything more than a temporary lull rather than a genuine end to hostilities. And that mutual bad faith, baked into both sides of this specific front, means the Lebanon war was never actually a separate conflict waiting to be resolved on its own timeline. It was always a subplot of the larger Iran war, one that would flare back to life the instant the broader regional temperature rose, and calm back down only when the wider Iran-U.S.-Israel negotiations showed enough progress to make continued fighting in Lebanon look strategically unnecessary. The 2,000 dead and 1 million displaced inside Lebanon, since this specific escalation began, were never fighting a war with a clean, independent resolution available to them. They were absorbing the overflow of a much larger regional conflict being negotiated in rooms in Geneva, Muscat, and Bürgenstock, rooms where Lebanon itself rarely sat as a primary party at the table, despite bearing some of the heaviest civilian costs of the entire war. Consider, too, what this reveals about the limits of American diplomatic leverage across this entire theater. Washington brokered both the original 2024 ceasefire and the April 2026 agreement. Washington was simultaneously running the primary negotiating track with Iran itself, the one producing the Memorandum of Understanding discussed in Bürgenstock. And despite holding the pen on nearly every major diplomatic document in this region, the United States could not actually stop Israeli strikes from continuing within hours of its own announced ceasefire deadlines, nor prevent Hezbollah from firing dozens of projectiles in direct violation of the same agreement. American diplomatic capital, even at its most active and engaged, has proven insufficient to actually enforce compliance on the ground from either side, a limitation that should sober anyone hoping the wider Iran deal alone will be enough to finally quiet the Lebanon front for good. Go back to that motorcycle, to the two people who never made it home after a ceasefire deadline that existed only on paper by the time their journey ended. Their deaths were not an aberration inside this conflict. They were the pattern itself, repeating across more than a year of broken truces, 10,000 documented airspace violations, 400 deaths recorded even during the periods officials described as the ceasefire holding, and finally 2,000 more lives lost and 1 million people displaced once the wider Iran war dragged this front back into full open conflict. Lebanon was never the quiet corner of this regional war. It was always the fault line running underneath everything else, the place where every failure of diplomacy elsewhere in the region eventually showed up as bombs falling on villages like Kinneret, and as ordinary people on ordinary roads never reaching wherever they were trying to go. Until the wider Iran negotiations produced something more durable than another memorandum signed in another resort town, southern Lebanon will keep absorbing the overflow of a war it never chose and cannot end on its own. Thank you for watching. Please like this video and leave a comment so this analysis reaches more people who need to understand what just happened. We will continue tracking this crisis as it develops.